Okay, well, hi everyone. Steve Wolf here, president of the Beyond Earth Institute. Welcome. This is our second workshop to review the financing models that will or could enable large-scale space infrastructure and habitats. I really want to make it clear as to why we are engaging in this study. I think it's important to recognize that identifying and implementing the right financing model is one of the most important policy challenges in our efforts to create communities beyond Earth. So thank you all for being part of this important project, and I hope will at least begin the process of addressing these challenges. So we've got a very exciting program today with Tim Chrisman. What I want to do is let me just share my screen and share a few slides to get us started. Okay, so this, as I said, is our second workshop. It'll be featuring the Space Corporation Act. But let me give you. So the agenda, we want to welcome everyone. I want to give a brief project overview. We want to introduce the evaluators for today. Then we'll get into the model Space Corporation Act with Tim Chrisman, and then the evaluators will give their responses, do some questioning as well as providing feedback. Just a quick review of what we're doing, what this project is all about. We're identifying the financing mechanisms that may be available for large-scale space infrastructure and habitats. We're reviewing and evaluating proposed models, right? That's what we're doing here today. We're picking models that are well considered, right? So we've got 3 that we are looking at, and we're certainly open to looking at additional ones as they might come to our attention. A very important part of this are the evaluators that we've identified, really folks that are top experts in a wide variety of relevant areas. We want them to give qualitative responses during these workshops, and we also are asking them to complete a quantitative questionnaire. We kicked this off on June 10th with a general discussion on financing large-scale space projects with this group of folks. Some of them, Hoyt will be on the call with us today. In fact, this is the schedule. So today we're at the 29th, and next week is July 7th. We'll be looking at a bank of space concept put forth by Jason Aspiotis of FinSOFI. So recommend you attend that session. Here are our list of our evaluators, and I won't read down all the names, but I do want to note that the top 5 here: Sidney Nakahoda, Gary Calnan, Tony DeTora, Courtney Stad, and Hoyt Davidson, and they'll be introducing themselves in just a moment. The criteria that we're setting, and this is really for the evaluators too, as a reminder, we're evaluating this proposal on comprehensiveness and completeness, chances of success, financial soundness, diversity, and enabling communities beyond Earth. To what extent this proposal would enable communities beyond Earth. And that's really it. I'm going to stop sharing there. With that, I would like to introduce or ask each of our evaluators to briefly introduce themselves so you get to know them. And so on the backside of Tim's talk, we can jump right into their reaction. So Hoyt, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. I'm Hoyt Davidson. I'm the managing partner of Near Earth LLC, which is a commercial space industry focused investment banking boutique. We do a lot of M&A deals and early stage equity capital raises, and a lot of financial and strategic consulting for investors and industry players, and strong interest in space policy, and very happy to be invited to be part of this.
Okay, and Courtney, Courtney's next. And Courtney, I would just say, just briefly, he is someone who is when you talk about commercial space development, he has been part of that history almost from the very beginning. Not to age you at all, Courtney, but you've done so much for this field. So
too kind, and it's a real honor to be part of this group, many of whom I've known for decades. And it's so nice to be reconnected so many of you and some new folks as well. Been in this business for 40 years, 1/3 in the government, from White House, NASA, Commerce to what is now the FAA. And the other part was in a whole variety of different commercial space businesses. Currently run a little boutique consulting firm where I have a stable of clients involved in all various elements of space infrastructure, and knock wood, on the eve of a very, very large scale financing for a Pathfinder optical satellite system. So it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today. Thank you, Steve.
Okay. And let's see, Tony DeTora.
That's me. So I'm one of the co-founders of the Beyond Earth Institute with Steve, and I also serve as the Vice President of Policy Coherence. So hopefully our policy is coherent. I did spend 10 years working on the Hill in the House of Representatives for a senior member of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and then I transferred over to the committee itself, where I served as senior policy advisor. Before that, I spent some years lobbying Congress for commercial space legislation, including the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tony. And Tony's experience on the Hill is particularly relevant to considering this proposal today. Gary?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Gary Calnan. So my background is in economics, business, and entrepreneurship. I hold a CFA charter. I'm a graduate of the ISU Space Studies program. And I'm co-founder and CEO of Cislunar Industries, where we are creating a metal processing technology to provide metal materials for everything from propellant to in-space manufacturing, both in space and on the surface of celestial bodies. I personally believe that we are now seeing the beginning of the next industrial revolution in space. And obviously innovative financing structures like those we're talking about here would certainly help to de-risk and accelerate this process. And ensure that we actually reach that vision that we're all sharing. So, thanks for having me, Steve. Appreciate it.
Great, thanks. And Sidney Nakahoda.
Thanks, Steve. My name is Sidney Nakahoda. I'm a co-founder and a general partner of Seldor Capital. We are a pre-seed fund that invests in space startups. In parallel to my activities at Seldor Capital, I'm also a lecturer of international public affairs at Columbia University.
That's great. Well, thank you all again. And with that, I'm going to, I want to hand this off to Tim. Now, Tim, just give me 1 second. I'm gonna make you a co-host, and so you'll be able to share your slides. And you should have that invite. Tim? Uh-oh. Let's see. I think I might have lost him. Tim. Hey, Tim.
Hey, Steve. Sorry about that. Not sure what happened.
I'm not sure, and I'll take the I'll take the responsibility for that. I'm making you co-host. Do you want to make Tim a co-host for the meeting? Yes. Try that again. So you should now have the ability to share your slides.
Alrighty, there we go. Yeah, so thank you, Steve, and the Beyond Earth Institute for inviting me here to present on our Space Corporation Act, which is a proposal circulating around Congress right now to create an infrastructure development corporation for space. This is as we'll get into, a hybrid of a lot of different things the federal government has done over the years that has been updated for space and is, I think, one of the exciting tools to be able to talk about that Congress is actually considering. So I'm told before I go into any pitch, I'm supposed to define what the problem is, so that way we all know what we're talking about. And many of you on this call today, and that will watch the video later, understand the role of NASA as pushing the frontiers and the boundaries. And our question then is, who is developing what they've explored? We now have Space Force that has gotten a lot of attention because not only is it the newest space element within the federal government, but there's a long history of the military taking on roles in developing in places that the government doesn't have a coherent strategy for. And so there is a sort of default thought that, well, if NASA doesn't, Space Force will. And as a former Army officer, I will tell you, you give the military something to do and they will do it. If it's outside their core mission, it's not going to be done as well as you would like. And so we ask, well, who is Space Force? What is Space Force protecting? Who is doing the creating of that which Space Force will defend? And ultimately, we're all here because the private sector has driven the space economy forward over the past 2 decades and innovated at a pace that only the private sector can do. That doesn't mean there's not a role for the federal government. And as Jeff Bezos talks about when he talks about the success of Amazon, he built that on the backs of roads and post offices that he didn't build. And who is enabling that success for space? That matters because the space community has seen these ebbs and flows over the past several decades where hype builds around a new thing in space, landing on the moon, the space shuttle, and now with the commercial space sector, where we reach the peak of inflated expectations, if you follow the Gartner hype cycle, or we reach the chasm in G.A. Moore's diffusion theory, and the space economy falls through it. We're now, as I indicated with these arrows, nearing the point where the space economy has been at least twice before and dropped off. And so I think what this workshop and the others are seeking to do is ensure that we successfully translate the momentum and expectation in the space community into sustainable development long-term. And that's where we think our Space Corporation can come in and play a role. The vision of this organization as an infrastructure development corporation is to unleash America's future, to take a nation founded on the frontier that spent the 1800s conquering and the high seas, the 1900s dominating the air, to move into the 21st century and continue that momentum in space. And ultimately, this is a chance for America to do it right. The Space Corporation is modeled after the ComSat, Commercial Satellite Corporation from the 1960s, which grew into Intelsat almost immediately. And so while this would be an American tool to open the frontier and increase employment and economic growth in America, space is not an American playground. And it has always been a place of international cooperation that the US has led. And this would be a tool to expand that, just like ComSat did for commercial satellite communications in the 60s and 70s. We scoped the mandate of the Space Corporation Act in such a way to ensure that the lessons of previous infrastructure development corporations like ComSat, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, were learned from and made better, in that the scope creates an organization that would look for long-term projects in those roads and rails for space, as we like to call it, and make it so that there is a smooth ability to go to, from, through space and derive the benefits of space here on the ground. Ultimately, though, this corporation would need to also facilitate interactions between not only space and space-adjacent companies, but the government. And being a private federal corporation with 51% government ownership and 49% public, that is a perfect vehicle that already sits at the gap to bridge the divide between those two sectors and help portfolio companies and the government alike to understand the unique needs and desires of the other. The sort of why the Space Corporation, the value proposition that this organization would bring is to make space just another domain where humans go to. No one founds a mountain company. No one says, I am going to the desert to build my new company. They just make a company built around an idea, a product, or a solution that they believe in and are excited about. And it happens to be located somewhere. And that's because the infrastructure that exists here on the ground allows them to functionally ignore the terrain they're in many cases. The Space Corporation would allow that sort of routine nature of space by creating long-term, durable, and sustainable methods of not only space access, but sustainment while you're in space, while also generating the sort of political goodwill through jobs on the ground and economic development on the ground to ensure that space is not seen as a playground of billionaires or some scientific frivolity. The Space Corporation would do all of that through, as I've said already, the creation of this space infrastructure. We'll get into more about the categories of that because we thought it was very important to define better what those categories are. And in the draft legislation that's circulating on the Hill right now, there's a breakdown of the sorts of projects that this corporation could fund. We did that in part because of lessons learned in history. ComSat being a prime example. They owned part of a professional sports team after about 20 or 30 years of existence, despite having a mandate to create an international satellite communication system. There was some finagling of mandates, and ultimately the corporation was able to do things like that. And we're seeking to narrow the mandate down to ensure that money spent is well spent. Also, we're looking to revitalize employment across the country and direct it into the space economy. The vast majority of places that have been left behind in the last industrial revolution and as we've transitioned to an internet economy are jobs that we need in space: machinists, welders, HVAC technicians, miners. These are jobs that, with very little difference, are going to be done in space with the help of robotics or other assistive tools. But ultimately, if you can weld an airplane, you can weld a rocket body. And that's a message that is not heard in places like Scranton, Pennsylvania, and Akron, Ohio, because space isn't real to them. This workshop and the Space Corporation are all about easing access to capital. Last year, about $9 billion flowed into the space economy from venture capital, high net worth individuals, and the like. Ultimately, that's short-term money. The vast majority of deals in space companies are less than 7 years in their term. It's very difficult to get credit for the majority of space companies unless you're a large prime or have other diversified portfolios. And so the goal is to make credit, the assessment of risk, and the financing of companies across the space economy easier. That in part will also help reduce political uncertainty with a new source of capital. And it will also ensure that there is not a dependence on the budgets of NASA or the Space Force for the sustainment of the space economy at large. we're already at a point where commercial space is larger than government space by some estimates, but there is still a huge chunk of money that flows into space from the government. And removing uncertainty around the ups and downs of policy changes, of shutdowns, of budget freezes, it won't eliminate the uncertainty, but it will at least reduce the risk of it. So the Space Corporation would be organized, as it is called, in a for-profit corporation model. It would be chartered by an act of Congress passed into law. So rather than being incorporated in a specific state, it would be incorporated by act of the United States government. It would be given the authority, among other things, to issue loan guarantees that are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. This would be similar to the Department of Energy's loan guarantee programs that it runs, where since 2005, it's issued about $35.5 billion in guarantees with a roughly 3% default rate and over 10% return on investment. Those of you who are in the commercial banking world or know about the 15-year default rates and yields know that that is a fairly respectable return for low risk loans. Another tool would be bonds, very similar to the Tennessee Valley Authority's ability to issue bonds, again, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government at low interest rate prices to finance large projects. In the Space Corporation's case, the bond issuance would be in part to fund revolving direct loan funds or SBIR style loans, but it would also be to fund this loan guarantee portfolio. The combination of these would ensure that the Space Corporation is not wholly funding any large investment, and that the risk of any single project failing is borne not just by the Space Corporation, but by a variety of private lenders who have essentially had the government loan guarantee come in and buy down the risk of the first 5, 10, 15% of the loan, thereby enabling them to better assess the return that they could get from that. Initial modeling that we've done comparing the Space Corporation's authorities as written in the draft bill with the Department of Energy's loan guarantee programs, Tennessee Valley Authority's bond issuance authorities, as well as other examples throughout the government, have yielded an answer to the question of what would the Space Corporation be able to invest? This question is particularly important because the bill as written requires no federal appropriation. There is no outlay of federal money required for this Space Corporation to function. In fact, that is one of the points of pride when we're circulating this on the Hill, is that this is a model that in the past has been able to work without new government spending. And as we've seen over the past several years, oftentimes the top line amount of appropriations in federal proposals is the issue that causes heartburn, that causes things to be derailed. And so being able to do this work without federal appropriations is one of the strengths of this proposal in our estimation. But back to the portfolio. So Space Corporation has the ability, through having nearly half of itself available for sale, the shares available to be sold on the public markets, to raise a little over $3 billion based on comparisons to other government-sponsored federal private corporations and similar style infrastructure development corporations that we've looked at through history and then adjusted their public offering prices for inflation. We also think that there is a cap, at least initially, while the markets feel out the Space Corporation, for the corporation to issue about $21 billion in bonds, again, federally backed bonds. Government sponsored entities, their bond portfolios range from about 10 billion all the way up to well north of 300. The larger bond portfolios are mainly the housing, GSEs, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. And so we remove those from our modeling because those are not directly applicable to this. And we chose instead to center on TVA as the most direct comparison, albeit one with a smaller mandate. And so the bond portfolio is the one that has the most space to grow, so to speak, as the Space Corporation grows. So these two sources of capital raise, when leveraged in a fairly conservative loan guarantee program modeled after the Department of Energy, where there is a requirement for between 7 and 10% of the outstanding loan value to be held in reserve as the guarantee, the Space Corporation would be able to make roughly $250+ billion in guaranteed loans. These would be bundled loans with large institutional investors in partnership with Treasury and other federal agencies who may have a stake in that. We've designed this sample portfolio to have a range of commitment ratios for these loan guarantees, reflecting a bias towards the more conservative end of having essentially $1 of reserve for every $10 loaned, and also building out a revolving direct loan fund that would be used in cooperation with other infrastructure investment firms like Carlyle, KKR, and the like, to directly fund in a larger stake in investments that would be of more interest to the government. And so the corporation would want to have a larger stake in their success or failure. Ultimately, this modeling indicates that the Space Corporation over its first 10 years would have an economic impact of nearly $150 billion across all 50 states, a little over 2.6 million new and supported jobs, and states would see over $10 billion in new taxes at the state and local level. Now, the Space Corporation would be making investments that are 10+ years in scope. And this is done because the goal is to not crowd out current sources of private capital in the market. And the vast majority of VC funds are 10 years or less. And so while this economic impact is modeled over the essentially next 10 years, we do assess that the first 10 years of the Space Corporation's life would enable it to deploy essentially half to a little over half of its maximum assessed portfolio from the last slide into the economy, even though a large number of these projects are going to be long lead time, slow build projects. By the 10-year mark, it should be at a roughly 50% burn into those funds. So I promised that we would get into a little bit of the investment categories. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly so we can get to the question and answer part. We've broken these categories down to access, sustainment, and support, and I'll talk about each one of them a little bit more. So access is really the to, from, and through space. We tend to emphasize the from space and through space a little more because, as we tell congressional delegations, being the center point of bringing anything back from space then allows whomever does that to re-export those goods and thereby continue to increase the local economic impact. A handful of the sample investments for this category are off to the side there, and they range from the Civil Reserve Space Fleet, which would be the analog to the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, where airlines are paid a yearly premium from the government in order to have the access to those air fleets if and when the government needs to. It's essentially an insurance program in case of emergency. On the sustainment side, this is the sorts of investments that would enable the ability for companies and entrepreneurs to show up and plug and pay and play. Very similar to the strip malls around the country, cul-de-sacs here on the ground, where if you have the ability to show up with your equipment, there is the basic backbone there, whether it's power, water, whether it's fuel, those things that you need just to live. Many of these are also things that the government would need for its operations on the moon or Space Force's security missions, such as the Strategic Fuel or Mineral Reserve. There also is probably need for the government to have a place in space manufacturing hubs or commercial stations. And so development of these does serve the dual purpose for both government and the private sector. The final category is all those things that happen in space that directly benefit the ground and the industrial base on the ground needed to support a vibrant economy beyond Earth. And so this may be advanced material foundries here on the ground or space-based solar in space. And these are the sorts of projects that are designed not only to support life beyond Earth, but to maintain support for beyond Earth activities here on the ground, to ensure that space is not seen as the playground of the rich, but instead the next frontier of humanity where fortunes are made, exploration happens, and it benefits everyone, regardless of whether we want to go to space or not. And so I'll wrap it up there and open the floor to questions, comments, critiques, and rude comments.
Hey, excellent, Tim. Great overview. Just a couple of comments before I let the evaluators get into it. Attendees, non-evaluators are welcome to ask questions in the chat field, and we'll monitor those. Certainly evaluators can pull questions from there. I'll be looking at those as well. With that, I will ask the evaluators to, what I'd like to first ask them to do as a first question, and then we can kind of work from there. But as a first reaction, I would like them to give an overall reaction to what they've heard, and maybe some of the strengths and areas for improvement that they see, or what they see from Tim's proposal. So with that, I see Tony. So I can ask you to go first, Tony, if you'd like.
Outstanding. All right. So Tim, thank you very much. That was very interesting. I like the approach. Obviously, I think one of the key strengths is anytime you can reduce reliance upon appropriations or budget cycles from the government, you're in good shape. I disagree with you that it's uncertain. I think it's pretty certain that the government is dysfunctional at this point. And if you're relying upon it, you're in deep trouble. So one thing I would say is that it's not clear to me how it would work out over time, especially if you've got your capital wrapped up in so many longer term investments, and how that would play out, and how the failure of some of those investments, because how that would impact your ability to continue to fund projects over time. So those were just my initial comments. So, but in the chat, actually, Chris Quilty asked a question about the Ex-Im Bank and what kind of role they might play, which goes into a little bit more I had. So why couldn't these space bonds, space grants, whatever, be put forward through an expanded authority of an existing public corporation or federal agency? Why is it necessary to create an entire new entity to do this?
Yeah, and let's hold the answer to that question. I want to get first reactions, and then we'll come back to that question. And Tim, you could think a little bit more about that. Just also generally, let's make sure that we're focusing our questions, just like Tony did, on the proposal at hand, and not try to bring in too much other stuff that could be considered. So we're focusing just on Tim's proposal. And with that, why don't we have Hoyt go next?
Okay, so no questions at this point, right? Just general thoughts. I think I'm supportive of this. I've tried to push similar things that didn't quite make it to Congress or out of the Department of Commerce. So I do think there's a role for government to play, and there is some structure, whether it's exactly this or something close to this, that's worth pursuing. So I applaud your efforts and time you put in to design it and develop it and get it out there and being heard. So generally supportive, but lots of questions and tweaks I'd love to discuss. Yeah.
Okay, we'll get into that. Courtney Stad, why don't you, what's your
let me piggyback on Hoyt. I have a lot of questions about it. I also want to applaud Tim and John and company for thinking it through as thoroughly as you did. But a couple of reservations. The ComSat Corporation was riddled with a lot of turf issues. There's been a small body of literature that's developed critiquing the original architecture of that act. It led to a lot of turf fights with the State Department, led to all sorts of issues with some of the smaller companies trying to break into the monopsony hold that the large carriers had, including an Earth station technology. And there was some, I think history has proven that the draftsmanship of that act was poor in many ways. So just as there were benefits, one could argue that there were also unintended consequences, which often happens when you have the government attempting to put together a one-size-fits-all attempt. Final observation is that after about a half century of a monopsony by the government, where there was essentially a desert in low Earth orbit, we now have this wonderful churn and froth going on in the marketplace with the inevitable failures and bankruptcies and restructuring. But paradoxically, that points to a dynamic that's been overdue. Not sure that at this point in time, this is really the type of structure that's needed to address this dynamic. So that's sort of an appetizer for a longer discussion. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Courtney. Sidney and then Gary.
Right, very intriguing proposal. I would say that several of the ideas introduced are badly needed for the development of our space activities in the context of financing. I definitely echo some of the thoughts related to the need for the creation of a new organization, especially when the Exim Bank seems to fulfill some of those requirements. A couple of questions that to kick off the discussions. First, if I got correctly, the proposal entails the creation of a for-profit organization. And so if you could elaborate on why that would be a better model, especially when we compare other similar initiatives, more recently perhaps the creation of the Millennium Challenge Corporation in 2004, that was also created through a congressional mandate from Congress and operates from a more traditional, with a more traditional structure. And a second question for us to discuss is maybe instead of an organization that does everything related to financing, what we might need is an organization that coordinates several efforts that are distributed across different agencies in the federal administration. So this is just to kick off the discussion.
Okay, well, thanks, Sidney. And I think that is an example of offering alternatives. And so again, let's try to keep our focus on what Tim is offering as opposed to saying what we could do. So, and with that, Gary, your initial comments.
Yeah, no, I like the approach in general. It seems like something that you could get sold to Congress the way you're sort of setting it up and pitching it. There's definitely a need for the long-term patient capital to build out this space infrastructure that I'm not sure is currently there. I did, the questions that popped into my head as I was listening to the presentation, I didn't see anything that really would indicate how to prevent the funding mechanism from being captured by primes or large companies. Or will it be like carve-outs for small business and that sort of thing? And I know you focus a lot in some of your other presentations I've seen about trying to spread the initiative around to other areas of the country that are less likely to be engaged in space. Are there going to be sort of congressional requirements for geographic distribution, that sort of thing? So I'm just curious about those kind of points.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. I think that's our evaluators for today. Tim, hopefully you're taking notes on those questions. So let me just give you a chance to respond to as many of the questions that have already come up.
All right, sounds good. So the first, or I guess the first pair of questions were around how do you keep this going if and when failures occur, and sort of ensure the long-term access to capital doesn't dissolve with a handful of high-profile failures. And then that then dovetailed into, so why can't this be done within other organizations? And I tied those two together because I think they're related. And the answer is the way that this is designed is such that there is a central body that functions as the bundler of investments by providing these loan guarantees for the vast majority of its portfolio. It is needing the support of outside private capital to do the work. And that then enables multiple stakeholders to be involved, not only in the loss, but also in the risk evaluation. The Department of Energy's program that's been running now for a little over 15 years has been able to do this with great success, has about a 3% default rate, over $35 billion of loan guarantees. And despite that default rate, has still returned 10% over those $35 billion in loan guarantees. And so this can be done within other organizations with existing authorities, provided they're tweaked. And that is an option. We don't think that's a good option because changing what exists and enabling entirely new domains for them to be used in creates a situation for internal stakeholders where something has to give, especially in this case where no new money is being allocated. And now we have set ourselves up for a natural opponent to the proposal by virtue of the fact that we are taking away from an existing organization's mission, mandate, or personnel. And so by creating the new, not only do you resist having those resistors, but you also have a chance to design something that can pull from a bunch of different models and thereby be more effective. And I completely agree with you, Courtney, that ComSat was poorly written. That's probably the only 5-page law that's ever been passed into law that survived for 30 years. But that absolutely was riddled with problems. And one of the ways we're looking to ensure this is not repeating those mistakes is by making the Space Corporation function more like In-Q-Tel, the intelligence community's venture capital firm, where Space Corporation is essentially required by virtue of the fact that it does loan guarantees and partnership loans in the form of these revolving funds to take minority stakes in any of these investments. And so instead of having to directly finance and build these satellites, these pieces of infrastructure, the Space Corporation would be acting as a bundler of the financing from the private sector and buying down the risk to those large institutional investors. Let's see. Why for profit? The main answer is to sell equity and be able to raise capital in that 49% of the organization that is not publicly owned. That thereby enables there is a public set of shareholders that decreases the chance of essentially a hostile takeover by a single prime. And if a prime is attempting that, it's being done in a public fashion where there are reports being filed by when shareholders are buying certain percentages. We have, because this is a fairly common sort of concern that is raised, we have tweaked some of the language in the draft and have been working with staffs on Capitol Hill to make sure that the language that is in the bill reflects a need to ensure that not only can organizations receiving money from this entity not hold more than a certain percentage of the corporation, but also that any corporation receiving money and also owning a stake in the company require additional levels of review and have a mandated special report to Congress listing why the corporation thought it was necessary to invest in those organizations rather than others. Ultimately, that may not stop the sort of prime takeover, which sounds really cool when you say that, bad in function. It may not, but I don't know what could, absent a completely government-controlled entity that may not have the benefit of acting at the speed of the private sector and having the same ability to raise capital.
Okay, Tim, why don't we pause there? What I want to do is I want to open it up to the evaluators. I'll leave it up to you to ask questions and keep the conversation going. And if anyone feels like they're not being heard, we can stop and adjust. So why don't you guys just go at it? Whoever has the first question, just go for it.
I'm happy to start. Tim, as Courtney mentioned, I guess I would caution against mentioning or tying this concept too much to ComSat, because for the reasons Courtney mentioned, it just ended up making a bunch of gold-plated, overpriced satellite providers. It wasn't until SES and Luxembourg and PanAmSat, Renee and Selmo busted up that monopoly that the satellite industry really started to take off. So I wouldn't tie this concept to that too much. There was one thing that Intelsat did, however, is it was effective in bringing the world together as an international body to share these infrastructure costs. So I think you mentioned you thought that if you started the Space Corp in the US and the world saw US leadership, there would be other countries would create their Space Corps, and then you would maybe have something like an Intelsat in the future. Can you talk about how you see that international participation, involvement working? Because I think this is an international effort requirement, and that international participation is really key. But I don't really see how this evolves to that. So if you can help us with that.
Yeah. So the long-term goal is that there is anything being built as infrastructure in space is, while it may be for the use of a single country, has the potential to benefit multiples. And GPS is a prime example of sort of the ground-facing space infrastructure that has global benefit. And so the idea is leveraging the fact that the US created the Space Corporation. Now there is an opportunity for the US to go to partner nations and say, this is how much we are going to put into the Space Corporation through subsequent rounds of appropriation or funding, or this is what we're doing in terms of loan guarantees. Why don't you buy in? We'll create a international consortium where our Space Corporation will play with the European version, with the South American version, and be able to leverage now an even broader pool of capital across our partners to do essentially the same thing. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I think it
did. Anyone can jump in, Courtney or Sidney. Sidney, was your question addressed? Or go ahead, Courtney.
Tim, I was going to ask, who would appoint sort of the governing body? What's your vision? Remind me of the language, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So the initial incorporators would be appointed by the president, and would include choices, 6 in total from Congress. One Speaker of the House would choose one, minority and majority leaders of the House and Senate would also choose one. But then going into the long-term board, 3 of those 13 would be selected by the president, confirmed by the Senate. 1 would be, or well, 2 from the House, so 1 from the Speaker and 1 from the Minority Leader, and the same with the Senate. So 1 minority and majority leader each get a appointment for the government's share of the directors. So that's the 7 of the 13. The remaining 6 would be appointed by the shareholders of the corporation, those 49% of shares that were sold, the subsequent board after the incorporation. Those 6 would be voted on from there.
Well, one could write a whole dissertation on political abuse of institutions. What type of metrics do you have in mind in terms of trying to ensure that the appointees have some modicum of qualifications to govern?
Yeah, so on the government side of the directors, there's a mandate that each appointee be from a related industrial sector to the Space Corporation or the projects it currently has underway. And the goal in the act as written is that there not be any single sector or business size that has more than 20% representation on the board of directors. In practice, that's probably not a workable vehicle for a 13-member board of directors. But there is, as written, a requirement for this diverse board that if the Senate is appointing people from large corporations, that would sort of fill the gap in that element. And so there need to be negotiations within the government appointees for large and small businesses, diversity in the sector. And ultimately, this board would not control the day-to-day operations of the corporation. The board would be in charge of creating an executive committee, including the CEO, chief finance officer, and the like, and they would be the ones that actually run the corporation on a day-to-day basis.
It wouldn't have any kind of strategic oversight?
No, it would. And so it would function more as a corporate board than a executive team running the organization.
So Tim,
Good. No.
Tim, you talked about the risk of some primes taking over the board, and the 51% government control blocks that. I'm actually more concerned about the reverse. Investors not even wanting to come into the Space Corp because the government controls 51% and they may become partisan or corrupt or political or whatever, and not be making wise investment decisions. How do you both block that from happening and ensure private investors that this board is going to have fiduciary duty to the shareholders and, do what's right, not political?
Yeah. So ultimately, the answer probably is I don't know that we can. We have tried to minimize that risk by spreading out who is able to appoint the government's share of the board, including giving the minority party in both the House and the Senate seats on this board. The board is also required to have a responsibility to govern this corporation for the public benefit and the benefit of, maintaining this corporation as a profitable enterprise. That is in part to ensure it can't go back and beg for money later, but also to ensure that it doesn't require a government running of itself.
So, Tim, if I could follow up on that, if it's a for-profit model anyway, why do we need the government to set it up initially? Why can't we just set it up as a private entity? You
could, but what the government brings to the table is the loan guarantees and the bond issuance authority. So that is essentially what the government's offering as upfront capital.
Okay, so could a state government do it instead of the federal government then?
Yes. The reach would be smaller, the cost of capital would be higher, but yes.
Okay.
Do you feel pretty confident that out of the gate, you'll be able to raise the $23.5 billion that you're anticipating, if approved?
If approved as written, I think that is a conservative estimate, yes. Because in part, only $3 billion of that is actual cash investment into the corporation. The rest is bond issuance that is then leveraged into investments. And so by sequencing it that way, I am much more confident in that total than I would be if I said we could sell 49% of this corporation for $20 billion. That's an aggressively large IPO.
Tim, to follow up on some of the previous comments there, just thinking about the political influence on how the funds get delivered. Can you describe maybe in a bit more detail what the decision-making process is envisioned for, who gets the loan guarantees or the investments, what investments to make, and how that might be separated from the politicians that are sitting on the board?
Yeah, so the, oh, is that me? Okay. So the investment process itself would be governed by the executive committee that was appointed by the board and the risk management office that it functioned not only as a traditional risk management team would in an investment bank, but also as the pseudo inspector general, being required to submit reports to Congress on the rationale behind the investments. And so those tools were put in there for that specific reason, to ensure that the decisions that were being made not only were well, just, and fiduciarily responsible, but also saw the public light. So yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you still have that time, having to report back to Congress, and there's a lot of needing to frame whatever you do so that you can convince politicians, no matter what, in some way or another, it still remains tied to politics, which obviously brings in, opportunities for political style corruption. But I don't know if you can get around that really with this kind of thing.
Well, so yes, it opens that up. However, the corporation would not be asking for anything. It would instead be submitting reports on what had happened.
Okay.
And so it's not a may we please. We've written this more like the 10th Amendment, in that all powers not written herein are reserved for the corporation.
So since the corporation is not going back to Congress for appropriations on a regular basis, the justifications don't necessarily have to appeal to Congress. They just have to be good enough that they can't violate the mandate or something.
Right. And it is a mechanism to ensure the investments are transparent. And if they become egregious, now there is a public record that would push Congress to act.
Makes sense. Okay.
Hey, Tim, the big part of this that I actually struggle with is how are you determining what is being invested in? Are you just considering whoever's making proposals? Is the corporation saying that, okay, we are interested in building, say, a communications infrastructure around the moon? That's what we want to do, and now we're interested in investing in that. I mean, I'm unclear as to what extent this is whether the corporation is directing the development of the infrastructure in space, or are you being reactive?
Yeah. So as designed, the corporation has the autonomy to be either. It has a list of the categories that it can invest in that can ultimately end up being revised if the board wants to. But as written, it has the flexibility to be proactive or reactive. And in how we talk about it and how we envision it, it would be more of a DARPA proposal request to industry that, we, the Space Corporation, have talked with these stakeholders. This capability is needed by this date. Submit your proposals, and then bundle investments in ones that either have merit or provide small loans or grants for studies to figure out where the potential lies from there.
And I'm assuming that every project that you invest in is required to have some kind of an ROI
Yes.
Whether it's 10 years or beyond that, whatever it is, or bundled with other things, that overall it's going to make money for the corporation.
Yes. So any investment has to be profitable for the corporation. It may be that DoD, NASA, or some other government entity wants to be the anchor tenant, and it's their investment that puts this corporation into the black, that otherwise it wouldn't have been. But yes, ultimately it is seeking money making, even if it's not for the first 15 years, money making investments.
Tim, I'm sure you've looked at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation as a model. There's a lot of similarities, obviously. One of the things they're allowed to do in terms of investments that I didn't see on your list is they can actually lend money to, say, an infrastructure fund up to 30% of the value of that fund. So it was a $200 million infrastructure fund. They could lend that fund $60 million, and that would enable the fund to kind of leverage that low-cost patient debt capital and close the business case for the equity investors of that fund. Do you envision that being something that the Space Corp would do as well?
Yes, absolutely. And so as written in the bill, the bonds and loan guarantees are the two largest tools available. However, it is authorized to issue direct loans. So those are still on the table and would be a useful tool, especially if they are able to be done in partnership with other organizations.
Sidney, we haven't heard from you in a while.
Yes, no, because there's a lot of food for thought here. I just want to go back to something that Stephen, I don't know if this is part of the scope of the discussion, but related to some of the roles and responsibilities associated with the organization. I understand that the scope of the proposal is narrow in the sense that you create an institution that will be providing financing. But the thing about the roadmap for international engagement, right? I think there's definitely room for coordination. And if you could share with us a little bit of how you see that as part of this of the plans for the corporation as it is right now, or think that it's something that we should be thinking about it in the future?
Yeah, so we talk fairly regularly with investors from Europe, South America, about how this is meant to be a started in America and grown out proposal, where if NASA or the DoD is working with you on space-related matters, then the Space Corporation should be doing the same. They should be coordinating with that government to find out how the Space Corporation can work with similar organizations or just financing organizations in that country, in that region, to better maximize the reach and scale of the investments that are made, especially for things that are going to be useful to the broader community, like those strategic fuel and mineral reserves.
And another question that I was just trying to think about the mechanics of how the corporation would operate. And it seems to be a strong reliance on bonds. I was just wondering if you had the chance to share the ideas with some market players to see to what extent those bonds would be attractive to potential investors.
Yeah, so at least initially, these bonds, because of their federal guarantee and similarity to about 10 or 12 other federal organizations that are able to issue bonds at below market rates, essentially, there appears to be continued demand for those sorts of notes on the market, ranging from, again, Tennessee Valley to Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. They all trade within about 0.5% of traditional treasury bonds most of the time, which indicates even though these are non-traditional federally backed bonds, there is an appetite for that sort of investment. So these bonds may initially require a slightly higher yield, but because of their federal guarantee, would still be attractive by virtue of the fact of that guarantee.
So, Tim, and I want to maintain a positive relationship with you, particularly and I'm going to explore a discrete project with you later this week, as you know. But I think you'd have to put me in the skeptical category for the moment regarding this particular structure. TVA, very targeted toward mostly rural electrification. ComSat, notwithstanding its checkered history, had a .22 caliber focus on a industry domain. This seems to be quite expansive, to say the least, and coming at a time where I think there is a very healthy dynamic in the marketplace. There's a whole range of financing tools, from one's credit card to VCs, investment bankers, and even within those industries, there's some adaptation taking place vis-a-vis commercial. There's a lot of TBDs in this industry. I've spent my life devoted to it. I believe in it, but there's still a lot of TBDs as to companies proving they can actually make money and be sustainable. The physics, the fundamental challenges of working and living in this dramatically different medium is confronting us with all sorts of challenges. We had Grant Anderson in our recent webinar talking about an ecoless system, environmental system. The minute you introduce human beings into the loop, you're into an unbelievable set of challenges. We had Gordon Ressler talk about some of the extraordinary advances taking place, robotics, servicing as we speak. And that's a very nice, discrete set of partnerships between industry and government with, knock wood, some real success stories recently. XM Bank is beginning to rear its capabilities after several years of hiatus in the satellite industry, financing industry area. And I do get nervous when we look to the feds to embrace particularly something of this ambition. It opens itself up to self-dealing. It opens itself up to political manipulation and lobbying, no matter how pristine or hopeful the organic charter may be at the beginning. And so I'm just wondering whether this wonderfully imaginative and creative mechanism is really meeting the moment. And rather than what we're watching develop organically, and then over time, seeing what we need on a discrete basis. It may well be that there's a need for a public partnership to deal with some of the eclipse, the space radiation, some of the fundamental challenges that are beyond any portfolio of any given venture, any given investment firm. So those are just immediate reactions that I have. And I'm also concerned about the signals that it might be sending into this rather fledgling emergent capital markets, both here and abroad, as to what level of predictability and certainty this type of corporate structure might introduce into the space. So those are just initial reactions, but I look forward to studying it in more detail, Tim. So thank you for your patience as I rambled on.
So let me follow up on what Courtney was saying, because I think the unique and odd aspect of what we're all trying to create here is exactly the opposite of what the government's done in the past. In the past, the government did fund a piece of infrastructure like the Transcontinental Railroad, and then they let the private investors develop the destinations and the markets. And here we're kind of flipping that around. The billionaires are taking care of the transportation component, right? They're building the Transcontinental Railroad, and now we're trying to get government to help fund the destinations and build the markets. You know, it's a much harder, more expensive thing to try to do. So it's fair to be skeptical. However, I don't know how we do it without something like this, to be honest. It's so risky and it requires so many tens or hundreds of billions of dollars without some government role. I don't know how you do it. I think the right government role is to be a lender, and maybe a secured lender with a lot of equity on top of you that's going to get lost first before the taxpayers get exposed. So I think it's worth figuring this out. But yeah, it's going to be hard to do, and there's going to be some failures and some risk. But going back to your comment about In-Q-Tel, I think now that they're allowed to share their portfolio, people can see just how well they actually did in terms of making investments and how much money they actually made for taxpayers. And so it can work if you get the government's and investment model right.
So I'd like to ask a question that hasn't come up yet. You said you've talked to several offices on the Hill about the subject. How far has your reach gone? Have you talked to relevant committees? Do you have, because I know it hasn't been introduced yet. Have you been House focused? Are you also talking to the Senate? General questions of that nature, and how far along the process do you think you actually are?
Yeah, so we have both House and Senate. We've circulated this since January, including in the committees, science, banking, armed services. So those are the main committee staffs we've hit. We have talked to all 535 offices, and we have about 75 members in the House who have said they will co-sponsor it. We're negotiating with original sponsors there, about 10 or so original sponsors. And on the Senate side, we have about 24 who have said they would co-sponsor once introduced, and are negotiating with 3 or 4 for regional sponsorship.
Okay. And I assume that those numbers are bipartisan as well.
Yes. The only reason it has not been introduced in the House is ensuring the right mix of bipartisan original sponsors. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, as guys, Tony and I know that's not an easy process. So good luck with that. I just to piggyback on what Hoyt and Courtney were saying, and I do agree more with Hoyt that I think, there's sort of a range in terms of as we move forward and try to identify the right way to finance how we're going to fund all of these things, especially as these things get more and more expensive. Yes, there's money coming into this market and like never before. Is it okay to simply allow those investments to happen organically? Or is there a role for government to sort of direct and control that in a way that doesn't create a stranglehold, right? So potentially you'd have, if you create a bucket of a couple of $20 billion worth of money, that's going to suck all of the interest from the industry into that. And how do we get a piece of that money? And that may be a good thing, if it's managed correctly, or there's definitely potential for just skewing and warping what was already a nice organic process that's been underway. So I think that's definitely what we want to consider. But I'm with Hoyt. The Beyond Earth Institute understands that we need to be very creative on how we're managing the risk that's involved with these size of investments. I want to give our evaluators, since we're almost to the hour-and-a-half mark, I want to give the evaluators an opportunity now. This is all the positive side, to give recommendations to Tim as how he may improve his proposal in some way or another. So and to make any closing comments that they might want to make. So I still see Tony on my screen. So I'm going to pick on you again. Then we'll go around the horn.
Okay. You've heard a lot of, everything that we said, and I'm sure you've thought of most of that to begin with as we move forward. So, what I would suggest is obviously you get your bipartisanship in a row before you introduce, and make sure that it does not become that kind of partisan football as you move forward. So that's what I would suggest.
So true. Courtney?
Piggyback on what Tony said, and I would add, Tim, I think you and John and company would benefit from establishing a little more rigor in your pantheon of priorities. You've mentioned classes, but I think trying to bend what you see as the top 2 or 3 critical priority in the infrastructure challenges, I think would be enormously helpful. And Steve and Hoyt and company, I think we'd be happy to give you our 2 cents on that front.
Yeah, please. That would be phenomenal.
Sidney?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good starting point for a conversation. My suggestion is try to simplify as much as possible. I'd like to just give this feedback to my students in order to make the message clear. And when we innovate, we always think about like which areas we innovate, right? If we innovate too much, like that adds a lot of complexity. So if you can, for example, use benchmarks of previous institutions, organizations that you're getting inspiration from in order to create a space corporation, I think innovating in this space is already hard. So the less complexity you add to the idea, the better.
Good point. And Hoyt?
It's not letting, oh, there we go. It wasn't letting me unmute, sorry. Yeah, I guess I would echo what Courtney was saying. It would be helpful, I think, in terms of selling the idea to pick even like one or two applications or uses, infrastructure, and explain what's going on now and how hard it is to fund and how unlikely it is to get done in a timely manner and in a way that government, wants it to get done, and then how it might happen if you come in and help close the business case and whatever. I think that'd be immensely helpful, probably the congressman too, as well as investors. So, but I hope to keep track of your progress and wish you luck. And I was part of a review team at the National Space Society that just sent you a multi-page critique of suggestions and recommendations. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that. I think it just went out this week. So you may not have gotten it yet.
I haven't seen it, but I will go find it.
It may have gone out yesterday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I couldn't echo Hoyt's comment any further because it's how important it is to, I just get the sense that there's this very big smorgasbord of all sorts of possibilities that the corporation could be investing in. And I think really trying to hone in on what are the key pieces of this infrastructure that, say, in the next 15 to 20-year horizon that we really should be investing. I think that would help a lot. Although there again, you're picking winners and losers, but that's also the challenge. But anyway, Gary, you have the last word here, and then Tim, you could we'll give you a chance to wrap up with any closing comments you want to make.
Yeah, I guess my only closing comments are I think it there's definitely a need for a vehicle for long-term patient capital to sort of accelerate the infrastructure build out in space. So I think it's a good approach to that in many ways. I think it seems like something that is sellable to Congress. So I think it could be achievable, and I think that's important. My main concern still remains, given the setup, the potential for political corruption and how that maybe doesn't happen in the beginning. I think as Courtney mentioned, but there's always that potential as we get further along with something with such a big pot of money. So I don't have any other advice to give. I think I sort of agree with what the others have said. So the simplification thing would certainly be helpful that goes for any kind of pitch, I suppose. But that's all I've got. Thanks.
All right, Tim. I'll give you get the last word before we sign off.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. No, thank you all for your time. For the comments. I think I say this the majority of times I talk with Congress people, that the idea we have right now is not what we started with. And I guarantee you by the end of the week, we will have tweaked what we have because of the comments from here. And this has happened anytime we have run this idea into smart, thoughtful people. It has molded, evolved. We're now up to version 37. And so by the time this gets introduced and sort of leaves our hands, we want to have run it into as many people as possible to get it as good as possible. So we don't end up with a 5-page comm set. So yeah, thank you all for this.
Well, thank you, Tim. And actually, I really applaud that approach. The biggest risk you could have is to come up with the answer and not be willing and flexible to adjust as you go along. And I'm sure you're like us, you're in this for the long haul. And so what this will evolve into over time, I imagine that we'll hopefully all will sort of evolve together into who knows, maybe some perfect end game, so that we could achieve the overall goal of course, creating communities beyond Earth and opening up the resources of the solar system for the benefit of all mankind and all that good stuff. I do a couple of quick things. We are going to be back next week. Look in your email boxes for the notice for the next event, which will be on July 7th, and then we will be talking about the Bank of Space concept. Very interesting. I think maybe even the author is on the call here, Jason Espiotis. And a couple of other things. I mentioned that we have a questionnaire that we're asking our evaluators to respond to. Other folks on this call are welcome to fill that out as well. We may or may not use those responses, but I'd be kind of interested to see what other people might say in that questionnaire. So certainly feel free to complete that. My email I just posted is in the chat field, swolf@beyondearth.org. Certainly welcome any comments and thoughts that you have on this or anything that we're doing at Beyond Earth. And with that, I thank you all for joining us, and I thank our evaluators, and I thank Tim again, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks.